It's time again for the Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.
Hi, I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
And I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And we're the Insiders. And this week we're taking a look back at the election, statewide election for Supreme Court here in Wisconsin. Boy, that became a big deal. It was national news. The results came in. You could see it on almost any channel you wanted to watch. You would have thought it was a presidential race the way they were reporting it. Chuck, how did you see the results on Tuesday night? And what does that mean for Wisconsin politics going forward?
Well, what a difference 2.5 months make. I mean, I think that this was devastating to the Trump agenda, devastating, obviously, to Elon Musk, who really doubled and tripled down on this. And as Scott says, what was remarkable, if you turned on TV, you would have thought it was a presidential race. It was the lead. What's happening with Crawford? And then, of course, the 10-point margin, every county, not most of the county, but every county in Wisconsin went more blue, and we're going to talk about it as blue, progressive versus Republican versus the Trump victory. Every one of the counties was more blue. It was a 10-point margin. I really do think that Musk himself really made this a referendum on him. I mean, he's kind of a nerdy guy, and I think people have always understood that. But
most scientists are
not he's absolutely not the guy that you want to have leading the charge for this. And then showing these $1 million checks he's giving to people, I think he lost votes. So I also think that there were issues like abortion and some of these other things that were significant. I do think that the good thing for Crawford is she basically fought Schimmel to a draw on the issue of who's tougher on crime and who had more weak sentences. And I think that was important for her to be able to do because, as Scott and I have talked about, the public in the spring, the Republican mode here has been to go with, let's get all the sheriff endorsements. Let's say we're tough on crime. And they tend to believe the conservative and they tend to believe the man. So I was impressed that Crawford was able to do this. And it says amazing things for Democrats. Any Democrat who is wallowing in their sorrows about this means it's a totally new ballgame. The governor's race, the legislature next year should be in great shape. And by the way, even Republicans I talked to one yesterday who said, I don't see Wisconsin as that much of a purple state anymore, maybe for presidentials. Otherwise, this is a blue state. That's where we're at.
Well, it was a fascinating election, right? And I think that the Democrats set out to nationalize the race for Supreme Court, and they were successful at it in the end. They were able to nationalize it and receive money from donors from all over the country. They were able to get help from people all over the country. I had classmates who were making phone calls from California and writing letters from Boston. They were one from Peru. They were all very involved in trying to make sure this race was going to go to the liberal majority on the court. Not only did they nationalize it on the monetary level, they nationalized it with regards to the issues. The Democrats or the liberal majority said on the court, this race would be about abortion, that it was going to be about Donald Trump, and it was going to be about trying to get 2 more congressional seats for Democrats in Washington. And when I watched my colleagues from around the country talk about it, those were the issues they were all talking about, that they were cheering on as the numbers came in, showing that Crawford was winning. So I think the Democrats successfully nationalized the race. I think we also saw the death of the old model here, which Republicans ran for 30 years and dominated the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which is that in general, you just talk generally about your judicial philosophy and that get the endorsements of law enforcement. Even the liberal members of the court, Shirley Abrahamson, did things like that, would get all the sheriffs, get all the police chiefs on your side and say that you're tough on crime. And then when it came to questions about your judicial philosophy, just tell people, I'm going to call balls and strikes. I'm the umpire. I'm not taking sides in this battle. Well, that is an old and outdated model. Republicans need to acknowledge that. The polling showed overwhelmingly that almost 80% of the people who voted the other day were voting for the person they thought would give them the answers they wanted on the Supreme Court. Not necessarily weigh the facts and weigh the arguments, but say, no, I want someone who's on my side of these issues like President Trump, like abortion, and like congressional redistricting. And that's what happened. I mean, I will remind people that on the congressional redistricting thing, that the map we have in Wisconsin for the congressional districts was drafted by Governor Tony Evers. So that is who drafted the map that we have. Somehow that's gerrymandering now, and I expect that there'll be some actions there. What kind of things do you think, Chuck, from that race for Supreme Court carried over to the race for Superintendent of Public Instruction, which was held on Tuesday night as well? Or was that a separate race in people's mind?
It was not. And before I leave this topic totally, I find it interesting that Scott wants to say that the Democrats nationalize this. When you bring in Elon Musk to Green Bay, like the
Oh,
day
he
before,
helped.
the weekend before
He
the
spent
election,
$24
oh,
million to help the Democrats with their message. His appearance supercharged the
he is
Democratic
our
message that
he
this
is
is a
our Lord.
national election.
Okay. Okay, Scott, I want to tell you about the secret meeting that I attended in
Yeah.
DC a few months ago. And here was the deal. We talked with Elon and we said, Elon, come on, you're really best on the other side. Could you just do some wild and crazy things, come in at the last minute, give a couple of extra $1 million and drive the vote to the Democrats? He said, you bet, I'm on board with that. We'll save Tesla later. So we had the secret meeting of the Democrats and Elon Musk. And Elon's still got a little more work for us to do out there, but pretty soon he'll be done. Donald Trump will finally figure out that this guy is not an advantage for him. But I think he's done his work for us. And I'm very happy to say that I was part of the coalition that brought Elon together with Tesla. We're saving electric vehicles.
That's
and
now
it's a
going to go
wonderful day.
viral on the internet, Chuck, just so you know that. So
So with that all said and done, and oh my God, Elon Musk coming in, what a loss. I think that Scott, you kind of hinted at this, and the reality is, of course, that the other race was almost non-existent. Millions of dollars were spent on the state superintendent race, record numbers of dollars on that race. And yet that meant almost nothing. In fact, you can see what happened here is people went into the voting booth and they knew about Crawford and Schimmel, and they got down to Underly, some of them, and said, oh, what's this? I don't know who is who. Okay, I'm just not going to vote, because there was a significant undervote there. And the reality was that at the end of the day, I think it was just another version of, okay, it's the Dems and the Republicans, and how are you feeling? And what's happening is these big high profile races now have become a bigger thing. I mean, you might say Democrats tried to nationalize, but everybody nationalized it. This was the first chance for people to speak. And I think the problem that Republicans are going to have is, the worst thing in the world is when, for politicians, when they start being laughed at. And I think that Musk and then very closely Trump may be starting to get laughed at. I saw there was a letter from the Deputy Prime Minister of from Canada, John Manley, and it was unbelievable. I almost want to quote it for you. But he was saying, we can solve your problem. But we've got 10 provinces and territories, so we got to have 10 states. He said, but like the reproductive rights things, that's settled. Here, your people will be happy. Hey, by the way, we've got universal health care, cheaper than yours, and everybody's happy. Nobody goes bankrupt. Your people will love it. And he says, all we need to do is call it the United States of Canada. It's a hoot. You got to read this letter from John Manley. And I think we're at the point. It's so bad. You saw the stock market reacted terribly to Trump's tariff things. I think that they are in a really bad spot right now. And I will be interested to see how the Republicans can recover from. Because this election tells me that next year's governor's race and legislative races are going to be really bad for Republicans unless something dramatically different happens.
Well, let's go back to the superintendent's race for a second
Yes.
here. So I would say that it was an echo of the race for the Supreme Court. Not as loud, not as prominent, much lower profile. So there was an undervote of people who were like, I don't know anything about either candidate in this race. There also was Kinzer performed better than Schimmel did in many places. She was able to get Crawford votes in a number of places around the state. I think she was held back by the fact that there was $100 million spent for the Supreme Court and $6 or $7 million spent for Superintendent of Public Instruction. Very hard for that message to get through. Both candidates really pretty much advertised just the last two and a half weeks of the race. So they couldn't get their name ID up to where what would have been necessary so that there wasn't an undervote in the race. And also it was harder to draw a distinction. Underly was smart. She didn't defend her record. She just went after Kinzer and just did negative ads for Kinzer, which are very memorable to people. Negative ads tend to be remembered by voters by more than twice as often as a positive ad. So rather than defending her record, she just went after Kinzer. Kinzer tried to draw a contrast in the race, but didn't have sufficient resources to even get on Madison television to the last few days of the race there. Overall, I think that race was just the wins from the Supreme Court race essentially made it impossible for anyone to sail a different course in the race for superintendent. Even the media joined in. I mean, the Democrats were trying to partisanize the race. I understand that, but when the media at the end was like, okay, we said at the beginning of the campaign that Kinzer was a longtime Democrat, a blue dog Democrat, a moderate Democrat. By the end of the race, it was the GOP-backed candidate, Brittany Kinzer. It's like, wait, what did all the Democrats, where did all that go? So they just wanted it to be simple for people. I get it. Everyone's focused on the Supreme Court race, but it became down to the Democrat candidate versus the Republican candidate, which it really wasn't. But neither was able to get those messages out because they were just drowned out by the race for Supreme Court.
I think most of what Scott says is true, but remember, who's defending Kinzer here? We talked about this in one of our previous shows. Who was Scott Jensen's defending? Who supported her financially? It was the Republicans who supported. So it ended up, these races are now, you're not going to be able to do what Scott tried to do and what the Kinzer race tried to do, which is say, no, I'm really a moderate. I'm kind of in the middle here. It's part of what's happened to us nationally. And it's a sad thing in my view. But we've become so tribal that you got to pick your tribe. And she did financially pick her tribe. She was with the Republicans and the voucher thing and all that. But the difficulty is that once you're in that situation, there's no getting out of it. But I do think that race, there was no way that it was going to be different. And by the way, I also think Scott and I talked about this in one of the previous shows, and that is that this race, this superintendent race, has never been something Republicans get. Even in the heyday of Tommy Thompson, they could not win it. I think Republicans are going to finally say, that's enough, we're done. And it's really going to be kind of a primary amongst progressive. There were many people who voted not for Underly in the primary and actually voted for another candidate, Jeff Wright. Frankly, if he or some other moderate had been able to come through, the Republicans would have had a better chance to have someone who could argue that they were there for public education and therefore they were the ones to be considered. And I think Scott and I agree. This was probably the best chance over the course of 40 years that Scott and I have been around to have this race go to the Republican or the more conservative candidate. It didn't happen. I think it's time for probably both parties to walk away because the position doesn't have that much policy consequence anyway. So
I think we can agree on one thing, Chuck, that you said earlier, which is that the races are no longer nonpartisan. In Wisconsin now, from the Supreme Court down to the school board, there are very few races that are nonpartisan anymore. All of the races have become partisanized.
I think that's true. And frankly, in certain areas like rural Wisconsin or urban Wisconsin, there isn't really even a Republican running. It's amongst Democrats, say in a Madison or Milwaukee, and in maybe northern Wisconsin, most of Tiffany's district, you're going to find in old Dave Obey district, you're going to find that it's mostly conservatives that are running. That's kind of what you got around the state. I think at the school board, though, there's a little better chance. People do care deeply about their school boards for maybe something, but certainly any statewide race, it's partisan.
All right. We'll see you next week.
See you next time.
You've been listening to The Insider with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.